Today, our topic is the criminal justice system, and this is a massive topic. I've read several books, probably going into the thousands of pages on this topic, and I'm going to do my best to try to condense that into a manageable amount for you guys. It might kind of feel like you're getting the fire hose treatment this morning because there's just a lot of information that I'm going to try and present to you. But I'm going to try to do so in an understandable way and in a way that connects to Scripture and that will hopefully be practically relevant to you. But I do want us to begin our discussion on criminal justice by looking at what Scripture itself says about criminal justice, and particularly in the Old Testament. I think the Old Testament has a lot of insight into the nature of criminal justice because of the fact that God had established the nation of Israel with certain laws regarding criminal justice. And so we can see several key passages. I've highlighted just a sampling of these passages that relate to criminal justice in the Old Testament, going all the way back before the nation of Israel, going back to the days of Noah. Genesis 9:6, when God establishes his covenant with Noah, he sets new terms to restrain the wickedness of humanity. And one of those restraints on human wickedness is the institution of capital punishment. And so we read in Genesis 9:6, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." And we have other examples of the nature of criminal justice in the law codes of ancient Israel, in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So, for example, in Exodus 22, we have these instructions. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. If a thief is found breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there shall be no blood guilt for him if it's at night. But if the sun has risen on him, there shall be blood guilt for him. He shall surely pay. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. Deuteronomy 25 tells us, if there's a dispute between men and they come into court and the judges decide between them, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty, then if the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten in the presence with a number of stripes, in his presence with a number of stripes in proportion to his offense. 40 stripes may be given, but not more, lest, if one should go on to beat him with more stripes than these, your brother be degraded in your sight. And then Deuteronomy 19 says, the judges shall inquire diligently in the case of where an accusation is brought. And if the witness is a false witness and has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him as he had meant to do to his brother. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and the rest shall hear and fear, and shall never again commit any such evil among you. Now, a couple points I want to make about these Old Testament legal passages. It is true, we are no longer under the same Mosaic covenant as the ancient nation of Israel, so there may not be a direct correspondence to the way we practice criminal justice today. However, if you read, for example, what the Westminster Confession has to say about the law of God, it says that although the judicial laws of ancient Israel no longer oblige us, they do insofar as the general equity is concerned. So that key phrase there, general equity, is a relevant concept for how we apply the criminal justice laws of the Old Testament. We may not have as big of a problem with the theft of oxen and sheep today, but we might have a problem with the theft of car radios, for example. So there is still a relevant application for our contemporary society today. Generally speaking, the way we apply these judicial laws of the Old Testament is we look for the reason behind the rule. And that's what we mean by general equity. So, for example, there's the law that says you shall not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. Are you familiar with that passage? And do you know how the Apostle Paul uses that in the New Testament? It's to justify payment for preachers, right? They're doing the work for you, so they need to make a living. That's the principle that Paul is applying. He's using the general equity of that commandment and applying it to a contemporary situation. So these are still relevant for us today in that regard. We still need to look for what are the principles of justice in these laws that have continuing relevance for us today. Now, there's an Old Testament scholar by the name of Christopher Wright. He's looked at these biblical texts on punishment in the Old Testament, and he's concluded that there are certain principles established by these laws. There's the principle of retribution. That teaches that the offender was to suffer his just deserts, which would be appropriate to the offense. There's also the principle of purging. Guilt had to be wiped away from God's sight. and the principle of deterrence. You'll notice that last passage said that all Israel shall hear and fear. That is, to be afraid to do the same thing. There's also a principle of restoration. The offender remained a brother and was not to be degraded. That's why you couldn't inflict more than 40 lashes. So you still had to acknowledge the humanity of the criminal. And there's also a principle of compensation. Restitution was made to the injured party, not to the state as a fine, at least in the case of ancient Israel. Now we can talk about how is restitution supposed to work in our society today. But those are some of the key principles of punishment that we see expressed in the laws of the Old Testament. There is another more basic principle at work in these laws as well. These laws regarding crime and punishment tell us something important about human nature. And this is central to our discussions on the criminal justice system today. Your view of criminal justice today will be shaped by your view of human nature. And we can say, broadly speaking, within debates over criminal justice, there are two competing views on criminal justice based on these two different views of human nature. We can say there's the Augustinian view and there's the Rousseauian view. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with St. Augustine. You know the story of how he was one of the greatest church fathers in the early church. He converted to Christianity and became an influential bishop, and he wrote several books. He wrote a book on his confessions, and he wrote books on the Trinity and against the heresy of Pelagianism. One of his biggest contributions to Christian theology was the development of the doctrine of original sin. He recognized that the human heart is corrupt, and it needs God's redeeming grace. People cannot save themselves. They cannot improve themselves by self-effort because we have this corruption in our own hearts. And so this has been the traditional understanding of human nature within the West. But in recent centuries, a rival view of human nature has emerged. Now, you may recall from one of our earlier lessons in this series, I gave you the name Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was a French philosopher from the 18th century. He had a very different understanding of humanity. He argued that the source of evil was not internal, not within our own hearts, but it was external. It was the influences of society that corrupted us. By nature, we are good, or at least innocent. But because of the influences of society on us, whether that is poverty or discrimination or injustice, that produces bad behavior. These two competing views of human nature have given rise to different views of criminal justice. If you favor the Augustinian view, you're going to recognize the value of the principle of retribution, for example, that people deserve to be punished for their offenses no matter what their background was. You will also recognize the value of deterrence, for example, the importance of instilling a sense of fear of punishment as a restraint on evil. But when it comes to Rousseau, the competing understanding of criminal justice is more of a root causes approach to criminal justice. It's going to be a more therapeutic approach to criminal justice. Rather than focusing on retribution, the focus is more on rehabilitation and identifying what are those root causes that make a person enter a life of crime. Is that poverty? Is it mistreatment? And whatever the case may be. And so these are the two rival views of human nature that are manifest in our debates over the criminal justice system today. You got to understand this if you want to understand what's going on in the debates today over criminal justice. Is that making sense so far, though? Okay, let's keep moving forward, because now we're going to talk about what is going on in our society today and where are the debates today. Take a look at this list of names. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. What do these names have in common? They were all killed. Black civilians who were killed under different circumstances. Another thing they all have in common is their deaths led to a firestorm of media coverage. These deaths were very controversial within our society. You could say, I think with good reason, that it was these incidents, more than any other factor, gave rise to the popularity of critical race theory in our society today. Critical race theory has been around for decades, but why does it feel like it just jumped on us all of a sudden and overtook, every institution in society? Part of that had to do with the coverage of this. right? This was a major factor. This is what gave rise to the Black Lives Matter movement and related movements that were seeking racial justice. And they were arguing that a lot of the injustices in our society are rooted in our criminal system, the legal system. And so this helps to explain how we got to where we are today. In addition to these police killings, not all of them were police killings, but they were all killings, there's also another startling fact about America's criminal justice system. We have the highest prison population in the world, by far. America has about 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's prison population. So we incarcerate a massive amount of our citizens, far more than any other nation in the world. If you want to know what the numbers look like, this is a graph that I found online, recently published, that shows the numbers. So you can see here on the pie chart that shows you state prisons, local jails, federal prisons and jails, youth detainment, territorial prisons, immigration detention centers, and involuntary commitment, all for a grand total of about 2.3 million people. That's how many people we incarcerate in America. That is a shocking number. To put that in perspective, look at this. This shows you the incarceration rates of several of the founding NATO countries. So you can see towards the bottom, from the bottom going up, it's Iceland, Norway, Netherlands, Denmark, Luxembourg, Italy, Belgium, France, Canada, Portugal, and the United Kingdom. The numbers they're showing you here is the number of prisoners per 100,000 of the population. So United Kingdom is 129 prisoners per 100,000 of the population. The United States is 664. Now that number goes up and down. I think this is the recent number. It reached its peak around 2006 to 2008 when it was like 750, even more than that potentially. But it also varies from state to state. Look at what the number is in Tennessee. 838 prisoners per 100,000 of the population. That is a huge number. And some people will argue, and have argued, that that's an injustice. That shows that there is a failing in our criminal justice system. And also, people will highlight that in addition to just the raw numbers of our prisons, we see racial disparities in our incarceration rate. So I made these pie charts for you. It was very difficult to track down these numbers in like a single place. So this is sort of a compilation from different sources. And I did the best I could to synthesize all of this because some sources give you like the numbers by ethnicities and others give you the numbers by race. And so that makes it complicated because technically Hispanic is not a race, it's an ethnicity. So I did my best to try to put all this together for you, but I think you get a pretty clear understanding of what's going on here. The pie chart in the left is showing the U.S. population by race. Currently, we are 60% non-Hispanic white, about 18.5% Hispanic, 13.4% black, about 6% Asian and Pacific Islander, and 1.3% Native American. So those are the main racial categories in America. But look at the prison population. The non-Hispanic white population is underrepresented by about half. So we're 60% of the population, but only about 30% of the prison population. The Hispanic population is a little bit higher in proportion to the U.S. population as a whole. It's 23%. But look at the black population in our prisons, 38%. That's about triple the representation in the population as a whole. And so people will look at these numbers and say that these racial disparities are an evidence of something wrong within our criminal justice system. There was a book that was published about 10 or so years ago by a legal scholar by the name of Michelle Alexander. She's one of the leading voices for criminal justice reform in our society today. She is a legal scholar who has formerly worked for the ACLU, and she wrote a book called The New Jim Crow. The subtitle here is Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Now, I've made it a few chapters into this book already. It's a pretty large book. But she sets out her goal for this book in the opening chapter, and she has this to say. This is her thesis. This book argues that mass incarceration is, metaphorically, the new Jim Crow, and that all those who care about social justice should fully commit themselves to dismantling this new racial caste system. Mass incarceration not attacks on affirmative action or lax civil rights enforcement, is the most damaging manifestation of the backlash against the civil rights movement. The popular narrative that emphasizes the deaths of slavery and Jim Crow and celebrates the nation's triumph over race with the election of Barack Obama is dangerously misguided. The colorblind public consensus that prevails in America today, i.e., the widespread belief that race no longer matters, has blinded us to the realities of race in our society and facilitated the emergence of a new caste system. So that's her argument. And she argues that one of the driving forces behind mass incarceration in America today is the war on drugs. She argues that our war on drugs, which was, I think, first announced by, that term was first used by President Nixon, but then it was announced and implemented under President Reagan in the 1980s. She argues that that is the biggest factor that has given rise to our mass incarceration system. She has this quote: "In less than 30 years, the U.S. penal population exploded from around 300,000 to more than 2 million, with drug convictions accounting for the majority of the increase." I do want to point out, though, that this statement of hers is a little bit misleading, and let me explain why. Take a look at what she's saying here. The prison population used to be about 300,000. This was like in the early 1970s. And to this day, it's currently right around 2.3 million, right? So we're talking about a 2 million increase in our prison population. And she says drug convictions account for the majority of the increase. That would lead you to think that most of those 2 million people that are in prison right now are in for drugs, right? That's how it sounds, right? That's not actually true. Let me break down the segments of our prison population. Okay, so going back to this pie chart, 2.3 million. Now, it might be hard for you to read from where you're sitting, but I'm going to try and show you how many of these inmates are in on drug offenses. That's how many. You see that? That amounts to a little less than a quarter of the inmates overall. If we were to simply release everyone in the prison population that was convicted of a drug offense only, we would still have a massive amount of prisoners in our prison population today. The driving force behind these numbers is not drugs. About half of these offenders are violent offenders. They are in for violent crimes, and then added to that we have property crimes and public order crimes, like DUIs, for example, or weapons possession, things like that. That's most of our prisoners. It's not solely on the basis of drugs. Yeah, Eddie? Drug-related. That argument has been made, and that's possible. I mean, it is a little bit difficult to disentangle how many of those offenses are because of the fact that we have these drug laws in place as well. And that's where you're going to hear conservative voices divided over this point. Will we be able to reduce our prison population simply by legalizing drugs? Right? If we decriminalize drugs, is that going to reduce the number of violent offenses that we have or property offenses that we have? One thing I do want to point out is when she says that the rise has mostly been driven by drug convictions, it's true that most of the convictions that happen are drug convictions. But here's the reason why there's such a small portion of the prison population: because they serve shorter sentences. Right? Drug convictions, on average, amount to, on average, a less than 2-year sentence. Right? Compared to violent offenses or property offenses, these guys are away for several years, decades, for life sometimes. Okay, so there's higher turnover among the drug offenders. So that explains why they're a smaller portion of the prison population. But yeah, there are debates over to what extent would these numbers go down if we simply decriminalize drugs. The problem there, and this is none of this is my area of expertise, but the problem with that approach is there's going to be other costs to be borne within society. When you legalize drugs, you incentivize their use, you make them more available, so you're going to have more drug users, and that's going to increase poverty and unemployment, and that in itself can drive illegal activity as well in order for people to support their drug habits if they don't have a stable job, for example. So it's not clear to what extent these numbers could be reduced. Some have advocated, let's just simply call it quits on the war on drugs. Let's simply decriminalize it. John McWhorter, for example, has made that argument. I would want to see more information about what would be the effects of that. personally. And again, I'm going to give you a lot of facts today. I'm not necessarily going to give you a lot of clear-cut policy solutions, though, okay? So you'll be more informed by what I have to say, but you might be a little bit disappointed when it comes to, if you want me to tell you what to do, I'm not going to be able to help you out as much there.
Hey, Kyle. So
Yes, Ricky.
part of the caste system is, like you're saying, these people don't spend a lot of time, but it's on their record now.
That's true.
And part of that you carry with you is
Right.
how it impacts your job,
Exactly.
your ability to get credit or
Yep.
an apartment or
Yep.
whatever.
And that's a big part of Michelle Alexander's thesis in her book, is she's saying that the criminal justice system is not just impacting people that are in prison, because a lot of the drug offenses, those are people that are on probation. We have a lot more people on probation and parole than locked up currently. And that is sort of a stigma that they carry with them. And so, yeah, that is another reality of one of the results of our war on drugs. There's another factor that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at the racial disparities in our prison population in America today, though. It is also very directly a reflection on the rate of criminal offenses committed by different racial groups in America today. So this graph here shows you the homicide victimization rate in America. In America, in the US, the black homicide victimization rate is about 6 times that of whites. And most homicides in America are intra-racial, that is, members of the same racial group, one killing another within the same racial group. That's true for whites and for blacks and the Hispanic population and so forth. And so it turns out to be the case that about 90% of the black homicides are committed by members of the same race. So the black homicide offending rate is about 8 times that of whites. And so there's just a massive disparity in the rate of commission of crimes in America today. And so that is another very important factor for us to keep in mind when we're looking at the rates of incarceration in America today. Here's another fact that we need to grapple with. Look at the rates of drug use in America. Whites and blacks use drugs at roughly the same rate in America. In fact, it's a couple percentage points higher for whites. Whites and blacks sell drugs at roughly the same rate. However, look at drug-related arrests and incarceration at the state and federal level. There's a huge disparity here. Now, this is cited by folks like Michelle Alexander and others to say this is evidence of a racial injustice in our criminal justice system. And it's possible that part of these numbers are driven by discrimination to some extent. But again, do you remember what we talked about a couple weeks ago when we discussed the difference between univariate analysis and multivariate analysis? We have to keep in mind other factors that might be explaining these disparities. A couple of important factors to keep in mind is that most of the drug convictions in our prison population today are the result of plea bargains from more serious offenses. In other words, they would agree to a lesser sentence on a lesser charge to have the more serious charges dismissed. And so there's a disparity, a racial disparity in those numbers because, again, African Americans are much more likely to commit more serious offenses. That goes a long way towards explaining that gap, as well as the fact that when it comes to drug-related arrests, you generally don't go to prison on your first offense. You go to prison after multiple offenses. And so if we take into account how many of these convictions are the result of prior offenses, there's a disparity in that as well. Those variables do help to explain to some extent why we see these disparities today. So we can't simply say it's purely because of racial discrimination. Part of it might be partly racial discrimination, but there are other factors that need to be taken into account. And if we're trying to look at like the deeper causes, like the root causes of what is producing criminal behavior, one thing that I'm going to point out later on is that there are 2 variables that when they come together, they almost guarantee higher rates of crime. That is poverty and fatherlessness. When you combine those 2 factors together, you're pretty much guaranteed higher rates of criminal behavior. And that's true for every racial group. So, all right, moving forward here, you got a sense of what the numbers are, what the issues are. Now we'll talk about what people say in terms of solutions. Now I'm going to go back to Ibram Kendi here. Do you remember when I mentioned Kendi before? He's one of the leading anti-racist activists in America today. And he says that when it comes to dealing with crime, you have basically 3 options. 2 options are racist and 1 is anti-racist. I'll let him put it in his words. For decades, there have been three main strategies in reducing crime in black neighborhoods. Segregationists, who consider black neighborhoods to be war zones, have called for tough policing and the mass incarceration of super predators. Assimilationists say these super predators need tough laws and tough love from mentors and fathers to civilize them back to nonviolence. Anti-racists say black people, like all people, need more higher-paying jobs within their reach, especially black youngsters who have consistently had the highest rates of unemployment of any demographic group, topping 50% in the mid-1990s. So you can see, according to Kendi, the problem is a lack of jobs. If we provide them with better jobs, that will reduce the crime rate. There are a couple problems with that claim. To begin with, we see disparities in the crime rate among kids even before they reach the age of employment. In their early teens already, we start to see delinquent behavior. So we cannot say at that age that joblessness is the reason why they're committing crimes. Right? There's another relevant factor. Yeah, you could argue that, but here's another complicating factor. Yeah, you could claim that it was because of the parents being unemployed that they're doing this. But the other complicating factor is if you look at crime trends historically in America, it has not tracked directly with employment or poverty rates. Crime actually went down slightly during the Great Depression, when we had massive rates of poverty and joblessness, and yet crime was relatively low during that time. Conversely, in the 1960s, we were in a period of unprecedented economic prosperity overall, and yet the crime rates skyrocketed. So we do not see a direct correlation between the employment rate and poverty rate and the crime rate. So there has to be more going on that explains that. To say that we simply need to give them jobs is a little too simplistic. Plus, that also raises the question of why would a job be an incentive to not commit crimes, but the threat of criminal penalty is not a deterrent? Why do you only use the carrot and not the stick? Right? They're both different types of incentives, and psychologists have done the research. Whether we're dealing with positive reinforcements or negative reinforcements, they're about equally effective. Here's another specific statistic in response to Kendi's claim that the issue is simply poverty and joblessness. James Q. Wilson is an author that I've been doing a lot of reading on over the past few weeks, and he's done a lot of great research on the subject of criminal justice. He's considered to be the architect of broken windows policing theory. Are you familiar with broken windows policing? I'm going to get there in just a moment. But he has this to say about the relationship of poverty, joblessness, and crime. He points to this specific statistic. During the 1960s, one neighborhood in San Francisco had the lowest income, the highest unemployment rate, the highest proportion of families with incomes under $4,000 per year, the least educational attainment, the highest tuberculosis rate, and the highest proportion of substandard housing in any area of the city. That neighborhood was called Chinatown. Yet in 1965, there were only 5 persons of Chinese ancestry committed to prison in the entire state of California. Now, this is just one statistic, but it goes to show you cannot simply reduce the causes of crime to poverty, joblessness, low education, poor housing. Okay, there are cultural factors that are relevant here. To this day, Asian Americans have always had more stable families than other racial groups in America, by a pretty significant margin. They are way ahead of white Americans today, too, when it comes to the fatherlessness rate. And so I think that's why we have to say we cannot reduce the causes of crime to poverty. Family structure is just as important, if not more important, than the economic conditions of the family. Another relevant fact, going back to the issue of the killings of unarmed black civilians in America today, we also have to keep those numbers in perspective. Because a lot of research has been done over to what extent are we seeing police brutality in America today, and a study was just published by City Journal within the past week or so. The author of it was Robert Verbruggen, and in an interview, he has this to say to clarify the numbers. The data certainly rebut the most extreme versions of the Ferguson narrative. Now, do you know what Ferguson is referring to? That's the city where Michael Brown was shot. Was that in 2014 or 15? And so we see what happened in response to the killing of Michael Brown. You had massive protests across the country in response to that. with claims of systemic injustice in policing across America. So the data certainly rebut the most extreme versions of the Ferguson narrative, which originated in the aftermath of Michael Brown's death in that city in 2014. In surveys, many people say that they think American cops kill 1,000 unarmed black men every year. But the real number averages out to more like 20. And it's even lower than that if you just look at suspects who weren't attacking someone when they were shot. Contrast that with the black homicide rate in America today overall. That number is somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000. Okay? So what really is the threat? Is the threat really coming from the police? Now, that's not to say that there is no racial discrimination in our policing. There is, and even like City Journal, Robert Verbruggen acknowledges that there are other lower-level disparities when it comes to treatment by police. For example, in traffic stops, or aggressive or rude behavior by police officers towards racial minorities. We do see disparities there. So this is not to dismiss entirely the claims of racial discrimination or bias, but it is to put them in a little bit clearer perspective. The more extreme narratives that says that like the police are waging war on racial minorities in America, that's just not accurate. The numbers don't bear that claim out. And also, here's another reality that we need to keep in mind when it comes to our policing system. How many of you have ever heard of the Ferguson effect? Okay. The Ferguson effect, that was a term that was coined by Heather McDonald. She's another contributor, fellow of the Manhattan Institute. So she writes regularly for City Journal. She wrote this book that I read called The War on Cops. It's a terrific book, by the way, if you're interested in this subject. But here's how she defines it. Slandered in the media and targeted on the streets, officers reverted to a model of purely reactive policing as opposed to proactive policing that had been out of vogue since the early 1990s. The inevitable result? Violent crime surged in city after city as criminals began reasserting themselves, a phenomenon that I and others controversially described as the Ferguson effect. If you want to see specifically how that works, here's how it works. Step one, you have some kind of incident that draws media attention. A police officer shoots and or kills a black civilian. That results in protests and or riots that erupt in response to this perceived systemic injustice. As a result of the protests and the riots and the accusations against the police officers disengage from proactive policing, and arrest rates, especially for minor offenses, go down. And when the arrest rate for minor offenses goes down, the rate of more serious offenses goes up. So violent crime, including assaults and homicides rise. That's why we've been seeing the homicide rate in America increase since about 2014, 2015. And in fact, we saw a huge jump in the homicide rate over the past 2 years. In fact, in 2020, that was the year when we had the George Floyd protests, the homicide rate went up by about 30% over the previous year, which is the highest rise in homicide in like over 30 years. Right, and we also see within certain cities, the district attorneys are no longer prosecuting because of these issues, because of the protests. And so we have lax policing and lower arrest rates, particularly for lower level offenses, but that is contributing to higher rates of more serious offenses. Yeah, Mike.
Heather McDonald was her genesis. Did she come up with this idea, or was she just sort of culminated it?
She coined the term, the Ferguson effect, but since she coined that term, other research institutes have actually plugged in the numbers and they've confirmed this. In fact, the Manhattan Institute just released another report that combined two different studies from different institutions that confirmed essentially the same thing. When police rates go down after social justice protests, we see a rise in homicide rates, violent crimes, and property crimes. That's right. Media coverage of police killings is disproportionate. If you look over the... Wilfred Riley actually did some studies on this. So he's a political scientist. He wrote the book Taboo that I've referenced before in this class. And he shows that the majority of media coverage on police killings is focused on the deaths of racial minorities, even though white Americans are killed at proportionally higher rates well, not proportionally, but at higher rates simply because they're a larger proportion of the population, but they only account for about 10% of the media coverage, right? So there's a huge disparity in media coverage there that contributes to these narratives that leads to like these claims of injustice. All right, another point when it comes to solutions. I mentioned this earlier, the theory of broken windows policing. So, as I mentioned, this goes back to the political scientist James Q. Wilson, and I think George Kelling, he was the other contributor to this theory. This is a proposal that Heather McDonald also supports in terms of what would it take to reduce the rate of crime in America today. What has worked in the past and what we are not doing as much anymore is this method known as broken windows policing. Here's how Wilson defines it. Social psychologists and police officers tend to agree that if a window in a building is broken and is left unrepaired, all the rest of the windows will soon be broken. This is as true in nice neighborhoods as in run-down ones. Window breaking does not necessarily occur on a large scale because some areas are inhabited by determined window breakers, whereas others are populated by window lovers. Rather, one unrepaired broken window is a signal that no one cares, and so breaking more windows costs nothing. It's always been fun. That explains why when there's one broken window left unrepaired, you're going to see more broken windows. And that has a ripple effect on more serious offenses. The citizen who fears the ill-smelling drunk, the rowdy teenager, the importuning beggar is not really expressing his distaste for unseemly behavior. He's also giving voice to a bit of folk wisdom that happens to be a correct generalization, namely that serious street crime flourishes in areas in which disorderly behavior goes unchecked. The unchecked panhandler is, in effect, the first broken window. Muggers and robbers, whether opportunistic or professional, believe they reduce their chances of being caught or even identified if they operate on streets where potential victims are already intimidated by prevailing conditions. If the neighborhood cannot keep a bothersome panhandler from annoying passersby, the thief may reason, it is even less likely to call the police to identify a potential mugger or to interfere if the mugging actually takes place. So you see the logic of this argument? This theory has been put into practice. Who knows where this system was put into practice most effectively and aggressively? Chip? Under Mayor Rudolph Giuliani in New York City. You want to see the numbers, the result of broken windows policing? That's the drop in violent crime in New York City. It reached epidemic levels in like the late 80s, early 90s, but when Giuliani became mayor and implemented broken windows policing, this is what happened. Now, there was a cost to that as well. The incarceration rate went way up. So there is a cost to this more proactive method of policing. If police officers are going to enforce more consistently lower-level offenses, that is going to increase the number of people who spend time in jail or prison.
Now, this is a univariate analysis.
Yes, it is kind of a univariate analysis. There are other factors that could be relevant as well. Now, during the 1990s, it's hard to say like what other factors could have contributed to such a sharp decline.
Window repair campaign.
Right. Yeah. So, we do have to keep in mind there could be other variables. So this is not necessarily a clear proof of the effectiveness of broken windows policing, but it does seem to be the most significant variable that we know of that led to this decline in violent crime. Because also, look at a comparison of the incarceration rate with the homicide rate in the U.S. You can see that there is sort of this inverse correlation here, right, between incarceration and homicide. As the incarceration rate increases, the homicide rate decreases. But look, for the past 10 or so years, we've lowered our incarceration rate. So we're no longer at peak level, but the homicide rate has gone up more as a result. Well, it seems to be that this is one variable that's probably relevant. So you can see there is a cost. Whether you do more proactive policing or less proactive policing, it will have an effect on society. Another solution, I'm going to wrap this up pretty quickly here, is that Heather McDonald proposes is what's called swift and certain, or SAC for short. I've also seen this abbreviated SCF for swift, certain, and fair. And she's arguing, like, these are the proposals that seem to be most effective. Studies have been done that seem to indicate that the length of a prison sentence is not the most effective deterrent. The most effective way of deterring crime is not through the length of the prison sentences, but it's the swiftness of receiving a penalty, and it's the certainty of knowing that it's going to happen. So this is how Heather McDonald describes it. There might be another way to keep people out of prison while also constraining crime, however. Tight supervision in the community, accompanied by modest but guaranteed sanctions for slipping up. A movement known as Swift and Certain argues that what changes criminal behavior is not the severity or length of a punishment, but its certainty and the swiftness with which it's proposed. So in other words, the idea here is that if you give swift and certain penalties for people who are, say they're on parole, and they pop positive on a drug test, or they miss a meeting with their parole officer, if there is a swift penalty for that, it doesn't have to be lengthy, but if they spend a weekend in jail, for example, that does seem to have a demonstrable effect on the rates of commission of crimes. And so this is one proposed solution being offered by Heather McDonald. I do have more to say. There's a bit more to say on this, but this is probably a good stopping point for us because we do need to get ready for corporate worship. So I'll pause here. We will come back from this point and continue our discussion next week. But let me ask, do you guys have any questions or comments about what I've presented? I've given you a lot of facts today, not a whole lot by way of solutions, but hopefully you have a little bit more understanding of what's going on in America right now. Father God, we do thank you that you are a God of justice and that you care about justice among your people. We confess, God, that we don't have all the answers, but we do have your word. And so I pray, Lord, that you would give us the wisdom to know how to apply your word to our current situation so that we could be people of justice. I pray, God, that we would be open to correction, to be willing to follow the truth wherever it may lead us, but also to hold fast to the truth of your word, first of all. I pray, God, that you would help us to communicate graciously and persuasively and to help people to know that true justice is not found apart from you. We pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.